You know, one of Yogi Berra, the great baseball player, one of his most popular aphorisms is, if you see a fork in the road, take it. And you may see a fork or two in the road tonight. So one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons is of a mathematician in an amphitheater classroom, and it's from the perspective of the students, and they're looking down at him, and his whole board is filled with this equation, and he's continuing to write to fill the board, and the thought bubbles coming out of the students are, what is he doing? What is he doing? What is he doing? And his thought bubble is, what am I doing? It may come to that. We'll see. I'm going to take a backdoor approach to a station at the Metro. And I'm going to start with these lines that all of you probably know. But picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. No, really. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Got it? Okay. Now, picture yourself in the bedroom of your childhood, or a bedroom of your childhood. Picture that as well. What's the difference between those two moments of imagination that you just had? There's a fundamental difference there, yeah.
One is experience and the other is imagined.
I would argue that, I will argue that they are both imagination.
Right.
One is experience. I assume for all of us it is the bedroom of your childhood. The other is fantasy. It's a fantastic imagery that we conjured, but we didn't actually experience it. So what that means is, for one of us, John Lennon's lyrics, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, is not real. It's a conjuring. It's what Joseph Addison called, the fancy element of the mind. Can't really exist. The other one is actually our memory of something that we would each regard as real, correct? Right? You hold that in your mind, you hold that in your heart, you hold that in your being. Now picture your bedroom that you're returning to tonight. Okay? Picture yourself going to bed. Is that equally real?
No,
Why not?
Because we're not there and we're not experiencing it. Just like the other two examples.
Okay. All right. So it's somewhere in between, because you're able to picture your bedroom. If I stopped at that, that would be real. But if I said, add yourself going to bed tonight, all you have to rely on is your experiences of going to bed, and then you add that to, okay. So what I want to talk about is the facility of the mind to create through imagination. Everything that is the summation of our lives, our constructed realities, who we are, what we think the world is based on our experiences. And our experiences essentially are based on or grow out of our sensations, our senses. So what we consider knowledge, what we consider reality, what we consider to be real, which is held in the memory, really is a creation that in a sense is not real because it's not here in real time and space, but all of us would argue that those memories are real, right? It's the facility of the mind, of the consciousness of the human being to create. We cannot not create. And we create through all of the information that comes into our bodies through our senses, through our five senses. We take that information, we assimilate it, we synthesize it, we accumulate it, we store it, and progressively that becomes what we understand ourselves to be. Michael was just telling me on the way here that he finished a manuscript that he's been working on for 30 years, which is his autobiography. And we were talking about the nature of memory in autobiography. So, when we think about any memory that we have, since it is a faculty of imagination, by imagination I don't mean that it's not real. By imagination I mean to recollect it. It's an image that we have. We recollect all of the information that we have in our memory, which is sensory information. So it is an aspect of the imagination, but we would not say that it's not real. Bear with me. Here's where I'm going with this. Samuel Coleridge believed that, among many other people, William Blake, the Romantics, first generation of the Romantics, held that everything that we experience in the world is only experienced through the faculty of the filters of our senses, right? And isn't actually what the world is. So, we're all experiencing that ambulance right now, right? We're not experiencing it the same way. It bothered some people more than it did others for some reason, okay? It may have conjured visceral panic in some people. It may have just been annoying to other people. If you think about the room that we're in right now, we would all agree to certain objective elements of the room. Are we all experiencing the same room right now? Yeah? No. Eleanor says no. Why not? Okay, so everyone here is in the same room, but we are all experiencing it differently. Therefore, at the same time, we could say that we are objectively in the same room, but we are all creating that room subjectively. The room is a creation for each of us. It's a creation that's coming to us through how we're experiencing it in our senses, our particular affect, if we're hungry, if we're tired, whatever it happens to be. Also, everybody here is in a different place in the room, which means you can't possibly experience it the same way, right? So what I'm getting at here is that what we're doing, and what Coleridge called the primary imagination, is the fundamental facility of consciousness to moment create what he called the eternal I am, to constantly be creating the world that we take to be real, okay? So all of our memories are, I would argue, imagination. Those memories stored in the imagination are secondary. They're secondary elements of the imagination because they can only happen after we've experienced the world, right? So the primary function of the imagination is the eternal present, is right now. Right now, we are inventing the world constantly through our consciousness, through all the information that's coming into us through our senses, how we're processing that information. Moment to moment, that goes away, and it becomes part of the secondary imagination. Okay, now, Coleridge said that we all have the primary imagination all the time, and it's an element of the divine. It's what William Blake would call the doors of perception. You know, he said if the doors of perception were cleansed, we would see the world as it really is. We would see what he would call infinity. You know, it's kind of like the biblical reference to we see through a glass darkly, okay? But that's how we see the world. That's how we create the world. Okay, it's the function of the artist, and in this case, it's the function of the poet, to take that primary imagination, to take that world that is going into him or her, and to, through their sensibilities, through their higher sensibilities, through the secondary imagination, recreate that world or some element of that world because they're seeing or experiencing into the essence of it something of value that goes far deeper than simply the surface values of the world, okay? Most of us don't do that unless there's a profound moment, like your first kiss or holding the hand of someone when they take their last breath, whatever it happens to be. For most of us, it's a fairly mundane world. Okay, what we're moving to then is Ezra Pound's poem. And to do that, let's do this. Come on in, or stay out, whichever you want. Either way, it's fine.
I was looking for the food trucks.
They're outside.
Did I go that way?
You can't come through here.
Okay, let me tell my.
Okay, so the poet experiences their imagination through a heightened sensibility. The artist experiences. So what the function of art, the function of poetry is to process some experience, some perception, some essence, and to try to find a way to express it at least for oneself, and hopefully in a way that creates a landscape or groundwork for others to experience something that is not the same experience, but that holds an essence that is deeper than the mundane. Okay? So, and that can be anything. It doesn't matter what it is. It can be you listening to me right now and saying, "What the hell is he talking about?" It could be the ambulance. It could be anything, and that's the power of the poet. Now, how does the poet do this? The poet does it through language, right? And what is language? Language is just a system of symbols that we agree on that hold the possibility for meaning, right? All right. So language is something that I'm using it right now, and you're not listening to my language so much as trying to glean meaning from my language. In poetry, what language is doing is trying to take the essence of the experience and put it into some kind of a form that recreates it so that it has the potential for something much deeper and more powerful. It's what Wordsworth called emotion recollected in tranquility. So you take an experience, you take a perception that a poet had, and it's just part of the imagination. But the poet then tries to take language and represent it in some way that its potential is powerful enough to transform into something else. Now, on a really mundane level, just think of it this way. If I say the word teeth, teeth, okay? You have some concept or some image of teeth right now, right? If I say pearls, and I've just juxtaposed teeth and pearls, you are putting an equation together between teeth and pearls because you cannot not do that, right? And how many times have you heard the teeth described as being pearly white, right? So that's a metaphor, teeth as pearls, but it's a dead metaphor because we've heard it so many times. If I say teeth and I say pickets, teeth, pickets, right? One image, one concept overlays the other, and all of a sudden you're struggling a little bit because there's a lot more distance between that. Now if I up the ante and say teeth, gateways, all of the associations you have with both of those two things, which is based in your memory, which is based in experience, which is just part of your imagination, is what you are bringing right now together to try to find some way to find meaning, that is to bridge the concepts between teeth and pickets, or teeth and pearls, or teeth and gateways. Okay, so let's take that and then move into this poem. And I'm going to start like this. Petals, flower petals, petals. Petals on a bough. Petals on a black bough. Petals on a wet black bough. Now, we would all agree that we know what petals are, we know what black means, we know what wet means, we know what a bough is, but what's going on in each one of your hearts and minds and sensibilities is different, is unique, because it can only be through your creative imagination based on your associations with those things. Petals on a wet black bough. So let me ask you, what kind of feeling, what kind of senses are involved? You are now carrying in you petals on a wet black bough. You have created that. What associations do you have with just petals on a wet black bough? What feelings, what emotions, what senses? What's coming out of petals on a wet black bough? Does it feel happy? Does it feel sad? Does it feel frivolous? Does it feel angry? What you have to do is trust feeling, right? Cummings said, since feeling is first, if you pay any attention to the syntax of things, no one will ever kiss you, right? Feeling. Sense is in here. Sense isn't up here. Forget about this. Petals on a wet black bough. Just, what does it evoke in you? What feelings? What thoughts? Yeah.
For me, it's wistful.
Louder, Eleanor.
For me, it's wistful.
Wistful. Yeah, go ahead.
I think.
Okay. So the word you used was wistful, and there's a whole series of associations that go along with that. But you also brought up the idea of transience. It's transitory. And it's wistful probably because it's very beautiful. And it comes and goes. Okay. Anything else? Wet black bough. Yes. Please, talk loud though.
For me, it would be,
Okay, so what that means to me is it's not going to happen.
no, it's not gonna happen completely, but
Yeah.
it'll always happen.
Yeah. Well, something is always going to happen. There's always going to be stimulus, right? But
Reaction.
how each of us responds to, if we're open and sensitive to it, how each of us responds to the feeling, the image, whatever sensations or senses are, what poetry is asking us to do is wake up. There's a beautiful quote, attentiveness is the natural prayer of the soul, right? So in order to play this game, you have to open yourself up to your senses. Now, I would argue, petals on a wet black bough, it's interesting to think about that being inevitably metaphorical for you, Tim. What I think is interesting about it is that there is no metaphor in that. That it's completely concrete imagery. It's petals, that's real, on a wet black bough. Those are all things that those are not abstractions.
How did they get off the bicycle?
Hmm?
How did the pedals get off the bicycle?
Petals, yeah.
Exactly, it's a translation process.
Okay, and so bow could also be this kind of a bow. Right.
Because
So what this is talking about is the facility of the mind to invent. Going back to that again, right? Facility of the mind to invent. The poet, in this case Ezra Pound, has no control over what petals on a wet black bough is going to mean to somebody else, right? And I'll get to where that came around for him in a moment. All right, but let's just petals on a wet black bough. Yeah.
So,
Well, wet and black are extremely powerful sensory words, right? I mean, you can feel wet and you can feel black. We can certainly feel wet and black in wintertime in Oregon, right? You go outside right now, most of the trees, the ones that are not evergreens, are going to be bare boughs without petals, and they're wet right now, and they're black, right? Every spring, petals will come back. At any rate, yeah, go ahead.
At this,
Right. Okay. And so I'm hoping to come around to that. This is interesting because we have an audience of people who are, first of all, most of you, if not everyone here, is familiar with the poem, and so you're already jumping ahead a little bit in terms of what I'm only giving you half of the poem right now, but I want to make the point that no matter what imagery we serve up in language, it is going to be recreated in you according to your own past, your own imaginative facilities. But it does exist. It exists as a product of the imagination. It's part of the content of who you are. You have to take that into the next part of the poem, which begins with faces. 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 Faces in a crowd. Faces in a crowd. Petals on a bough. Faces in a crowd. Petals on a bough. Juxtaposition of images. But these faces on a bough, on the bough. These faces on the bough. These faces on the bough, these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Okay, so you have a line that begins, these faces in the crowd, and then another line, petals on a wet black bough. Okay? So, take a moment. Just look around at these faces in the crowd. Look at each other's faces. Take an inventory of each other's faces. I'm looking at everyone. You can do it too. If you, I mean, really, look at these faces. There's something that we all have in common. There's a common humanity, and then there's also a uniqueness about each face. There's an absolute beauty about each face. Each face came into the world. Each face is going to leave the world. Right? If you take that and juxtapose it with petals on a wet black bough, and you take whatever emotional or sensory content that you bring into petals on a wet black bough, and all of a sudden you're looking at the other petals in this room, the other beautiful faces in this room, then you have something which is moving toward, I think, what Ezra Pound experienced in 1911 in a station at the Metro. We could say, in a back room at the tavern, these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. But the petals on a wet black bough don't actually exist. They're only in our mind, just like that child's bedroom, like the one you actually have at home right now. It's only existing in your mind at the moment, right? So it's an apparition. It's a phantasm. You're holding it as perception. It's a concept. You can argue that it exists, but in a sense it doesn't exist except as how you carry it in your imagination right now. You're not there. You're not experiencing it. I would argue that it's not real in a sense of experience, in a sense of presence right now. Okay? So it's an apparition. So the poem that Ezra Pound wrote that we're looking at tonight is called In a Station at the Metro. And the poem is the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. And that changes everything. And that's why I started with the idea of the primary imagination, the idea that it is the facility of human consciousness moment to create. And it is the more sublime facility of the artist or the poet to take an experience as mundane as this one is right now, just looking at each other's faces in this little back room in this tavern, to take that experience. Here come a couple more petals. Hi. And they just came in from a wet black bough. And they opened the door, it's all dark out there, it's all wet, here come a couple more petals. And those petals are thirsty. And there they go. They're gone. They're gone. So I couldn't have asked for a better moment for that to happen, right? What I saw was a door open, and I saw darkness, and I saw wet, and I saw two faces come in, and I saw them leave. The apparition, they only exist in my mind right now. The apparition of those faces, petals on a wet black bough, there you go. What I'm getting out of these comments from those of you who are sharing is a lot of individual perception, right? And what that goes back to for me is that what's happening is that you are not experiencing Ezra Pound's experience. The guy was standing in a metro in Paris. He was standing in a train station, a subway station. And the doors opened, and he saw these people spill out, and then they were gone, like those two fellows, right? And he had an experience of some sort.
That's a train going
Yes, that's great.
It's
Yeah.
just value.
Absolutely is.
It is in the metro.
Mm-hmm.
That's his observation.
That's right. Yeah, and that's great, because what you just did was you hold in your imagination what you have created from those lines is different from what I've created. And of course, I know his description in which he talks about faces coming out, but that makes it no less valid. But again, it underscores the point I'm making, which is that these are all very individual responses to a fairly mundane moment. Because how often do you see this? I mean, every moment is absolutely miraculous if you're able to cleanse the doors of perception, and see infinity in a grain of sand, according to William Blake, right? If you can see that, we can't, right? So that's the function of the poet, is to open our sensibilities and to help us to recreate, not the experience that the poet has. The poet, in this case, the poet has an experience. The poet sees more deeply into the essence, or tries to see more deeply into the essence of an experience. Not an experience such as, the first time you made love, but an experience as mundane as taking out the trash and having to wipe the snail off the bottom of the garbage pail, right? That has just as much potential for profundity as the first time you made love. And that's the function of the artist and the poet, to remind us to be aware as best we can, moment to moment, to be attentive. But we're not going to experience what they experience. We're going to experience what we are able to experience given our sensibilities and our ability to engage with metaphor and to engage with language. Okay? There's a lot more going on here. I'm a little bit worried about time. So what I want to do is read what Pound said about this experience, and then I want to give you the copy of the poem. And actually, there are several versions of it. So this happened in 1911 because this was published in 1914, September 1st. He said, 3 years ago in Paris, I got out of a metro train at La Concorde and saw suddenly a beautiful face, and then another, and another, and then a beautiful child's face, and then another beautiful woman. And I tried all that day to find words for what this had meant to me. And I could not find any words that seemed to me worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. And that evening, as I went home, I was still trying, and I found suddenly the expression. I do not mean that I found words, but there came an equation, not in speech, but in little splotches of color. It was a pattern. But it was a word. It was the beginning for me of a language. I do not mean that I was unfamiliar with the kindergarten stories about colors being like tones or music. I think that sort of thing is nonsense. If you try to make notes permanently correspond with particular colors, it's like tying narrow meanings to symbols. Pound said poetry is language most highly charged, right? So when the poem is successful, it creates this landscape for continuing creation. And I think that this poem is a good example of that. It certainly is for me. All right, so I'm going to skip some of this here. He says, my experience in Paris should have gone into paint. If instead of color I had perceived sound or planes in relation, I should have expressed it in music or in sculpture. So what he experienced was a sensation that was not language, but he had to take that sensation, find a way to use language that took his impression of the experience and express it through the power of language. So he says, all poetic language is the language of exploration. I'll skip that. A Chinaman said long ago that if a man can't say what he has to say in 12 lines, he'd better keep quiet. The Japanese have evolved the still shorter form of what he calls the hokku, or the haiku, and he gives two examples. The fallen blossom flies back to its branch, a butterfly. The footsteps of the cat upon the snow, plum blossoms. And he says, the one-image poem is a form of superposition. That is to say, it is one idea set on top of another, so that it's like a dialectic. It actually creates something that can only be created because of the juxtaposition. And it can only be created in each of us as each of us can create it. So, he said, I found it useful in getting out of the impasse in which I had been left by the metro emotion. I wrote a 30-line poem and destroyed it because it was what we called a work of second intensity. 6 months later, I made a poem half that length. A year later, I made a poem that was the following hokku-like sentence: the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And then he ends this by saying, I dare say it is meaningless unless one has drifted into a certain vein of thought. It is meaningless unless one has drifted into a certain vein of thought. You have to try to open those doors of perception. You have to try to clean the windows a little bit. In a poem of this sort, one is trying to record the precise instant when a thing outward and objective transforms itself or darts into a thing inward and subjective, which is what's happening all the time. I would go back to that original little exercise. All the time, what is objective and what is outward is always transforming itself through the lens and filters of our sensory perception and our imagination into a thing inward and subjective. Most of us are asleep to that. Most of us are not aware to any large degree of that, and that's the faculty of the artist, or those, maybe we all write, the faculty of our own writing. The process of our own writing is the process of trying to find that inner attainment. The Persian spiritual master Meher Baba has a beautiful quote that I love. It's, "To penetrate into the essence of all being," listen to this, essence. And essence, the root of essence is to be, right? So the poet's trying to do is find the essence of the moment. To penetrate into the essence of all being and significance, and to release the fragrance of that inner attainment by expressing in the world of forms truth, love, purity, and beauty. That's the only game there is to play. That's what the artist does. Try to penetrate, find the essence, and at least release the fragrance of it for someone else to bring in to themselves and find their way through it. Okay, thank you. This is the poem as Pound finally settled upon it. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. As you see, it's two lines with a semicolon ending the first line. And we could spend a lot of time talking about, and Eleanor's already alluded to. Are there enough? There guys should be enough. Already read it. There are so many different things that you can do with the structure and the oral values of the poem. And I'll just name a few of them. All the way through the poem, there is the part and the whole. There is the station in the metro. There are the faces in the crowd. There are the petals on the bough. So there's the part and there's the whole from which the part comes, or from which several parts come. There are also lots, thank you, there are also lots of sound values. Now, Eleanor alluded to some of those as well. You can look at the consonants, the pairing of consonant sounds, the T sounds, the assonant sounds, petals, wet, metro, the alliteration, black, bow. The poem is beautifully crafted just on the level of sound values. One of the things that I really love about it is the rhythm and the syllabification and how it tapers down. Now, if you turn it over, you see the poem as it was originally published in Poetry magazine in 1913. And the original publication is quite different. Those spaces give the poem a whole different value. And that's how I presented the poem. I began by talking about petals, right? Faces, the apparition. The apparition, 5 of these faces, 4 in the crowd, 3 petals, 2 bough, 1 with the interposition of wet and black. So the poem just tapers down, even in terms of its rhythmic structure, going from something large to something very pinpointed and focused. There are many other elements of the poem. The progression of the way Pound played with the poem from this original publication in Poetry magazine in 1913, you can see that he let go of those spaces in TP Weekly just a few months later, interposed the colon, but brought everything together. In Fortnight Weekly, a few months later, or maybe a year later, he presented another version of it and then finally settled on the one that tends to be the one that's anthologized the apparition of these faces in the crowd, semicolon, petals on a wet black bough. Semicolon, of course, indicating that there is an equation, that there's an equality. It's not that the faces in the crowd are petals on a bough, necessarily. It's not that the apparition is of the faces in the crowd. It could be that the faces in the crowd are apparitions of petals on a bough. Again, it's language most highly charged with potential for possibility. I just want to leave with a personal anecdote, and that is, in 1984, I was in an introduction to poetry class at Chemeketa, and I was blessed to have a master teacher named Lenny Held, who awakened me to deeper levels of poetry. I'll tell you, all I remember was that we spent a class session, a 50-minute class session on this poem. I don't have any memory whatsoever of what went on in that class session. All I remember is when the class session ended, and I walked out in the hall, 10 minutes between classes, students spilling through the hall, I experienced something that I could not have experienced without that poem and without the beautiful guidance of a master teacher, not telling me what the poem meant, but helping me to understand and create in myself the climate for receiving something that I could never have anticipated. I saw what for me were petals on a wet black bough. I saw transience. When I was a kid, I used to read the old Chinese poets, Kenneth Rexroth and Arthur Waley and those translations. And I thought, these old guys are all talking about transience all the time. What's this about? Well, now I'm an old guy, and now I know what it's about. Petals on a wet black bough takes on such a meaning for me. But in 1984, when I was still in my early 30s, even then, that flow, that idea of transience had an incredible beauty for me that I'm forever grateful for. So whatever Pound's experience was, doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that he created something that for some reason created something in me that allowed me to have an experience, which I think I would even dare to call an epiphany. And I'm grateful for that. And I think that's the real value of poetry when it's working on the level that I think we all want it to work on for ourselves, either as creators or as receivers. That's it.